Hello, church. So in this continuing age of social distancing and creatively figuring out how to stay connected as a church, and in response to some requests that I've had in recent days, this is the first of what will be 11 sessions of a Bible study. The way it will work is we had started a Bible study that was focusing on parables of Jesus. Not every parable of Jesus, but some of the central parables of Jesus. So we're going to be offering that class in total. We had gotten 3 sessions in and then had to stop initially because of the play that I was in, but then the coronavirus. So what I'm doing now is going to offer the first 3 classes that I had previously taught, more as a sort of recap. And what I'm expecting to do and what I hope to do is by the 4th class to move into a live, like a Zoom live setting, which will also be recorded. And then so those that can't make a live meeting, you could just have access to this on the church website. So that'll be how it intends to. I hope it works as we go forward with this, because I think it would be really cool to have the group together, say at the normal time on Tuesdays, 9 a.m. on Tuesdays. But we'll get to that. I don't know if that's exactly going to be the time, but we'll figure that out. But so the class itself is about the parables, as I've said, and some of the materials that you will be provided as you go to the church website. You're going to see some links next to this video when you see it. One of them will be the schedule. I have a schedule here of 11 sessions that cover some of the themes, and they list all the different readings that will be you'll be asked to prepare in advance. Today's class is just an introduction, so there's no reading, so you're very lucky. But your other materials that you'll need are a Bible with access to the New Testament, preferably, and then also in the Gospel of Thomas, there are 4 examples of parables that I'll be using. I put together a one sheet. They're very short, as you can see. So this will be on the church website as well. You'll be able to get the Gospel of Thomas parables there as well. And then also, when I go into my talk each time, I prepare notes that I use. I'll share those with you too, because there's a lot of stuff to take in. And so just know that if you're the type of person that likes to take notes, you're welcome to do that, but you don't need to. You can just sort of listen, and you'll have more materials than you probably will want to deal with. Before I get started with the intro to parables, I want to share some of the resources that I use to prepare my remarks in each class. Not really any order to these. I will use them freely. I kind of bounce back and forth. They all have wonderful insights and some limitation as well. This is a classic book, but kind of a heady book and a thick book, but written by one of the Westar scholars, Bernard Brandon Scott. And it's Here Then the Parable, an excellent book, but a little bit, it's quite it's a deep dive. So very worthwhile, though. He has another book that he wrote subsequent to Here Then the Parable, and it's called Reimagine the World, Bernard Brandon Scott again. This is another good book, a really good book, and I've kind of used his headings here as the guide to the structure of the class. So anyway, if you get this book, this is sort of the way that the structure is set up through this one. Another book I really like is by the scholar Amy Jo Levine. It's called, this is a book called Short Stories by Jesus. She's excellent and has really great insights into the parables. And another one who's excellent too, another Westar scholar named John Dominic Crossan, his classic book In Parables. There's other ones that I will use too. I certainly have some other resources, but those are some good ones if you wanted to, say, go out and find something that you could read maybe alongside. I think any one of those would be helpful. I have to say, I don't always agree with everything that's presented, and where I do and where I don't, I'll try to say. And again, this is a video now, so I'm gonna have to, I have to say this. I will do my best to give credit where credit is due for the different any quotes or different things like that, but there's no intention here to be doing anything except present material to help an intro level student kind of get into these parables. So I'm going to use freely. Again, I will give credit wherever I can when I come up with different specific quotes or anything from any of these authors. But I think aside from that, those are the materials. You've got all the other links. Let's get into talking about the parables. So what is this class about? Well, the parables of Jesus have got to be, well, they are. They're some of the most fascinating, rich, and important literary pieces within all of Western literature. They are brilliant in their ability to convey a specific vision, in particular, the vision that Jesus had of God and who this God is and how God and humanity relate. And so they are a beautiful and concise and powerful medium of communication. And they are, in many ways, a parable is simply a riddle. And I like the way the Gospel of Mark talks about it in Mark chapter 4, verse 11. It represents kind of a general position that a lot of folks hold about what a parable is. And Mark says here in 4:11, he says, "To you has been given the secret of the kingdom of God, but for those outside, everything comes in parables." Now, the you he was talking to there is the disciples. He's talking to them, and he's saying that parables are used to help explain things. Now, some people look at that text and they say, well, a parable then is just simply a child's story to sort of dumb it down for the common folk. You know, that's kind of where some people have gone. And the problem with that is if you approach Jesus' parables as these simple childlike stories that are just sort of very easy to interpret, you will come up with very trite, very shallow understandings of them. And the point is that parables, being riddles, are not supposed to be simple. They're not supposed to lie flat. And the truth is that depending on where we are at different times in our lives and the perspectives that we bring to a parable, we're going to find all sorts of different meaning. For example, when I was a college student, I attended a silent Zen retreat in Cambridge, Massachusetts. And so we'd be sitting there and meditating. And as someone that hadn't had a lot of practice in meditation, I kind of had to, struggling. And thankfully, every hour or two, we get called into a room with the master. And he would ask us questions, sort of like parables. They were called koans. And anyway, one of the questions he would ask is, what is the sound of one hand clapping? And when he asked me that question, I just did. But then he asked me again, what is the sound of one hand clapping? And I was like, oh no. And then he asked it again. What is the sound of one hand clapping? And I didn't think too much. I just smacked him on the knee. And he nodded. And he went on to another question, which I answered incorrectly, and he dismissed me. But the point of that is to say that the same question elicited three different sort of responses, different understandings. And in many ways, a parable is going to be much the same. That it's not meant to have this singularity of meaning. It's definitely something that is rich. And so our approach to the parables will be to look at them in context, to really understand what maybe they correlate to, if they're drawn, say, from anything in the Old Testament or anything that's previous in the particular gospel where they appear. We'll sort of look at that just to help provide some context. But we don't look at them as sort of these simplistic, easily understood things. Okay, that's our approach for this class. So what is a parable and how does it function? Well, literally, in Greek, the word parable means to throw beside. And that is to make a comparison. That's what Brandon Scott describes in Reimagine the World. It means to throw beside. It's a small story that's designed to elicit wonder, to open us up, to make us think. That's what it does. In Hebrew, the word for parable is mashal, which means proverb or riddle. And so again, these have many layers, and they're meant to. They're supposed to have many layers. And so a parable, when it's rightly understood or when it's rightly approached, okay, it should be something that kind of gets under our skin a little bit. And if we find that we read a parable or we experience a parable and we're like, oh, I really love that. It's just such a nice parable. If that's our approach, or if that's all we receive from a parable, then we haven't seen it correctly. Parables are supposed to sting a little, to zing, they get under the skin. Okay, we need to look more deeply if we just think, oh, okay, I really like that one, okay? And one wise thing that I think Amy Jill Levine talks about is, when you look at parables, it's not so much about what they mean, but what do they do? How do they function? Is it meant to provoke? Is there humor in there? Is it using caricature or irony? What device? What is it? What tools? How is it functioning? Is it designed to instruct, to inspire, to challenge? All of these things. And now look, most parables are doing many different things, but it's important to sort of just to try to identify, how is this parable functioning? So that's what we'll do too. Where do we find the parables? I love this question, because some scholars, Brandon Scott being one, insist that parables only appear in the New Testament. Okay, and only in only in the synoptic gospels, so Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and then the Gospel of Thomas, which I talked about before. Now, this is not the entire Gospel of Thomas, mind you. Okay, these are just the parables we're going to be looking at. But Scott sort of says, hey, these are the only places that parables appear, and Jesus is the only one to tell parables. Okay, they never appear on the lips of his opponents. Paul never talks about parables. He says the Gospel of John never has a parable, although I tend to agree with some of the scholars that suggest that the entire Gospel of John is like a parable. And there's a way to describe that, but that sort of takes us a little off, so I'm gonna do that. If you care to know more about that, we can talk about that another time. But that the Gospel of John doesn't have any parables in the same way that the other Gospels do is apparent. But there are scholars and there are parables who say this, and there are parables in the Old Testament. Two famous ones being one in Judges chapter 9, verses 8 to 15. I think this is in the notes. Okay, and that one's about a guy named Abimelech. I'm not going to go into the details of that story, but the next parable is one that you will know most likely. 2 Samuel chapter 12, verses 1 to 7. That's the parable that Nathan, the advisor to King David, tells him after the whole, Uriah and Bathsheba event happens. And Nathan tells him what's the parable of the ewe lamb. Now, if you've been watching our worship videos, I used that, was it March 15th? I think it was March 15th that I preached on. I used the story of David as part of the sermon. So I go back to that if you'd like to hear that one again. Otherwise, again, that's in the notes. So there are ways that the Old Testament provides some material that then became, the foundation or some sort of connector to how Jesus employs parable in his day and time. Now, what do parables tell us about Jesus? Not much. Parables are not. They're not autobiographical. They don't sort of go into all sorts of detail about, that the subjects of a parable they're not necessarily about the person telling them. They're most often fictions designed to, again, elicit a response, create wonder, instruct, challenge, all those things. So they don't tell us much about Jesus. And really all we know about Jesus is that he was born. We really don't know where or when. There's no agreement about that per se in the Gospels themselves, in the accounts we have. And then the only other thing we know is that he died under Pontius Pilate, but we really don't know when and why on those two. So we do know some things that happened between the time when he was born and the time that he died. And our best resource for that is the Gospel of Mark itself. But that was written probably some 40 years easily, sometime about 65 to 70, the Gospel of Mark was written down. And you've got all those years between when Jesus was arrested and died on the cross in roughly the year 30 to 33, somewhere in there. So that's a long time. I don't know about you, but I don't really remember too much from last week, let alone 40 years ago. I mean, clearly Mark had some resources, some handed down material that he utilized to write his gospel. But the truth is, what he used gives us no more of a definitive sort of historical outline of Jesus' life than what we have access to as modern people some 2,000 years later. And this brings up another point. This might only interest me, but my approach to the Gospels is consistent with more of the mainline and even progressive traditions, the way they look at the Gospels. And that is that they're not historical, factual accounts in as much as they are designed to communicate the truth about who Jesus was and the vision that he presented for the relationship between God to humanity. Okay, so it's these Gospels, none of the Gospels, the four Gospels or Thomas or any of the other Gospels are, in my mind, intended to present sort of this historical, factual, chronological, evidentiary, existence of Jesus. I'm not questioning that Jesus existed, but the function of the Gospels is not so much to illustrate, that this is exactly how it happened and when it happened in a chronological way, the way we often, in modern times, try to think of it. So, okay, so there's a lot of asides here, but I hope this is something that you still find valuable. And if not, then, you sure can let me know and we'll tighten it up for the next time. But a couple more things I want to say. Are there themes evident in the parables? And yeah, there are some themes. And the way we can determine the way the themes are set up is that in the different Gospels, you have parables that consistently appear next to each other, which is a way that scholars use to sort of say, all right, well, there's some consistency, some themes there. So maybe we can pick up, what are they both trying to say here? So for example, next session, we're going to be talking about this parable of the leaven. And in the cases where it appears, it's right next to the parable of the mustard seed. And that's in Matthew and in Luke, where it appears like that. Those two next to each other. And so it seems to be this theme about the kingdom of heaven starting off in small places, in small ways, growing from small beginnings. Then the next one, the parable of the hidden treasure and the parable of the pearl, those appear next to each other in various accounts. And they talk about how valuable the kingdom of heaven is. One other example would be the parables of the lost sheep, the lost coin, the lost son. We call it the prodigal son. And those all kind of deal with the themes of loss and redemption. And then the last thing I want to talk about is just a beautiful quote from one of our great modern parable tellers. And it's funny how last week I used a story by Franz Kafka. And now, once again, I'm using him for this closing quote here to help us kind of come to a nice closure with our understanding of our intro to parables. So here's what Franz Kafka wrote in his book, Parables and Paradoxes. Many complain that the words of the wise are always merely parables and of no use in daily life, which is the only life we have. When the sage says go over, he does not mean that we should cross to some actual place, which we could do anyhow, if the labor were worth it. He means some fabulous yonder, something unknown to us, something too that he cannot designate more precisely, and therefore cannot help us here in the very least. All these parables really set out to say merely that the incomprehensible is incomprehensible. And we know that already. But the cares we have to struggle with every day, that's a different matter. Considering this, a man once said, "Why such reluctance? If you only followed the parables, you yourselves would become parables." and with that rid of all your daily cares. Another said, I bet that's also a parable. The first said, you have won. The second said, but unfortunately, only in parable. The first said, no, in reality. In parable, you have lost. Don't worry, that one's in the notes as well. I may share a cultural heritage with Franz Kafka, but I can't say that I fully get what he just wrote. But I think it communicates the whole idea of how parable opens us up and draws us to those places of wonder and exploration and challenge. And that is what I hope we can do together as we walk through these 11 sessions in this Bible study course on parable. So for our next session, you will have some reading. And again, the links will be there and the schedule will be on the church website, but that will be Matthew chapter 13, verse 33, Luke chapter 13, verses 20 to 21, and then Thomas 96. It's all very short. And for next session, we'll be talking about the parable of the leaven. I hope that for those of you who have tuned in, that you've found this to be informative and helpful. And if you have any suggestions on how we might do it better, aside from the fact that I do want to move into doing it live, yes, I understand that. That will work, I think, more just efficiently and be more interesting, because it's always about the energy of the questions and the comments. I think that's what makes this so good. But anyway, please do provide some feedback. I'm happy to add things, take them away. But for now, thank you for tuning in, and I look forward to seeing you next time.